Why was she watching the clouds more than the movie? Maria Santos sat in seat 18C, her knees angled toward the aisle, a denim jacket folded loosely across her lap. From the outside, she could have been any other 28-year-old on an overseas trip, a backpacker with a blog, chasing photographs and memories across Europe. That's what her seatmate thought. That's what every flight attendant assumed when they passed her by with juice and coffee. But Maria had learned in a past life that appearances could be the best camouflage in the world. The Boeing 787 hummed beneath her, a steady vibration that most passengers never noticed. Maria did. 7 years of Air Force training had hardwired her to hear the language of engines, to read the subtle pitch shifts in their voices. To most, the noise was background. To her, it was a constant stream of information. She was typing on her travel blog, the soft click of the keys almost lost under the movie dialogue spilling from the headphones of the NYU student beside her. His name was Jake, and he had spent the past 30 minutes explaining the nightclubs in Amsterdam and which ones were must-see before sunrise. Maria smiled politely, nodding, but her attention was split. Part of her listening to him, part of her unconsciously cataloging the Boeing's responses to the atmosphere. This was supposed to be a year off, a real year off. No missions, no rosters, no debriefings, just her and a backpack, moving through cities without any more responsibility than catching the next train. She had promised herself, promised her best friend Ashley, that she would find out who she was without the uniform. But even now, cruising over the Atlantic, the uniform was still inside her. The captain's voice came over the intercom. Calm, practiced, reassuring. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Davis. We're currently cruising at 41,000 feet over the Atlantic. We may encounter some light turbulence, so please fasten your seatbelts and enjoy the rest of your flight. Light turbulence. Maria glanced up from her laptop. The words were normal enough. The tone wasn't. Her eyes shifted to the cabin crew. Rachel Thompson, the lead flight attendant, was moving down the aisle, smiling, but there was a stiffness in her shoulders. A glance passed between her and another attendant, quick, sharp. The kind of silent exchange Maria had learned to read in the cockpit when words weren't possible. Something was wrong. The first bump was nothing, a gentle sway that made a few drinks ripple in their cups. The second was stronger, rattling. The overhead bins. Maria closed her laptop, slid it into the seat pocket, and looked out the window. The clouds ahead were thickening, churning like water over hidden rocks. Atlantic weather was unpredictable, but this felt different, more aggressive. The Dreamliner flexed in the wind, but the way it moved. It wasn't just the atmosphere playing with them. There was hesitation in the aircraft's responses, as if the commands from the cockpit were arriving a fraction too late. Jake frowned, pulling his laptop closer. That's not great, right? Just weather, Maria said softly. Her voice was steady, but her mind was already running through possibilities. Minor control issue? Autopilot adjustment? A false sensor reading? Then came the announcement. Rachel again, her voice even but thinner now. The vowels clipped like she was holding something back. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing moderate turbulence. Please return to your seats immediately and keep your seatbelts fastened. The turbulence worsened. Service carts were rolled back into storage. Cabin crew moving quickly but quietly. Maria's fingers tightened on her armrest as the Dreamliner gave a sudden, unnatural lurch to the right. That wasn't turbulence. That was someone in the cockpit fighting the aircraft. She leaned slightly into the aisle, trying to see past Rachel as she disappeared behind the reinforced cockpit door. The sound of the engines had shifted again, a faint tremor at the edge of the usual harmony. She listened harder. The vibrations felt unbalanced. The trim may be off when Rachel reappeared minutes later. Her expression made Maria's stomach sink. The lead flight attendant walked fast toward the galley, speaking into the interphone with clipped urgency. Maria knew that body language. She'd worn it herself in combat zones. The look of someone doing their best not to show fear while adrenaline burned through their veins. Then came the call. "Ladies and gentlemen," Rachel said, her voice tight enough to betray the effort. It took to keep it level. "If there is a medical doctor on board, please identify yourself immediately. We have an urgent medical situation." The words echoed in Maria's mind. Urgent medical situation. In the middle of a transatlantic flight, 2 passengers, Dr. Chen and Dr. Parker, stood quickly and were led forward. The door closed behind them. Maria checked her watch. They were barely 2 hours into the flight. 6 more to Amsterdam. 5 minutes later, Rachel emerged again, and the thin veneer of composure was gone. Her eyes darted across the rows, searching for something or someone. "Ladies and gentlemen." She hesitated, swallowed, started again. "Captain Davis has suffered a sudden medical emergency. First Officer Collins is in control of the aircraft, but he requires additional assistance." The cabin went silent for a second. Then the murmurs began. Passengers turned to each other in disbelief. Some laughed nervously, thinking it was a bad joke. Others went pale. Then the Dreamliner dropped hard. A stomach-turning dive that drew screams from every corner of the cabin. Loose items floated briefly before slamming back down. The sound of crying rose like a tide. Maria's mind locked onto one fact. Dual pilot incapacitation was one of the rarest and most dangerous emergencies in aviation. And they were over open ocean. Rachel's voice cracked as she made one last call. "If anyone has aviation experience, any flight training whatsoever." Maria didn't hesitate. She unbuckled her belt, stood in the aisle. "I'm a pilot," she said, loud enough to carry over the chaos. Heads turned. Rachel froze, staring at her. 7 years, Maria said. United States Air Force, captain, multi-engine aircraft. Current on Boeing 787 systems. Jake's mouth fell open. "Wait. You're actually—" "Yes," Maria cut in. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from years of command. "Right now, we don't have time to talk about it." Rachel nodded sharply. "Come with me now." Maria moved forward. The weight of 320 pairs of eyes on her back. She had boarded this flight as a tourist. She was walking toward the cockpit as the only person who could save them. The cockpit door shut behind her with a metallic click. The air inside was different. Thicker somehow. Hotter. The recycled oxygen tinged with sweat and urgency. A low, persistent alarm tone pulsed from one of the consoles. Lights blinked in erratic patterns across the panels. Like a heartbeat in distress, Captain Davis was slumped in his seat, his head lolling against the headrest. Skin pale and damp. Dr. Chun knelt beside him, pressing 2 fingers to the captain's neck, counting silently. Dr. Parker was already fitting an oxygen mask over his face. The sight jolted something in Maria's chest, a flashback to another time, another cockpit, when she'd been ordered to keep flying while a crewmate fought for his life beside her. First Officer Collins sat rigid in the right seat, his left hand clamped on the yoke, right hand adjusting the throttles with jerky precision. His eyes were wide, darting between the instrument panel and the storm thrashing outside. Maria didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped forward. "I'm Captain Maria Santos, United States Air Force, 7 years, multi-engine, Boeing systems." Her voice cut through the layered noise. The alarm, the wind buffet, the hiss of oxygen. Collins glanced over, startled. He was young, maybe early 30s, and the strain was already etched deep in his expression. Sweat beaded at his temple. You're a passenger?" "Not anymore," Maria said. "Report." Collins swallowed hard. "Captain collapsed about 15 minutes ago. Autopilot's acting up. Turbulence is severe. Multiple system warnings. Environmental control. Hydraulic pressure fluctuation." "I have the aircraft," Maria said, sliding into the left seat. The muscle memory was instantaneous. Her hands found the controls as if no time had passed. The yoke felt heavier than she remembered, the resistance uneven. She assessed in seconds. Trim badly out of balance, altitude bleeding, speed creeping into the danger zone. The autopilot wasn't just malfunctioning. It was fighting the manual inputs. "Autopilot disengage," she ordered. Flicking the switch, the tone cut out, replaced by the raw sound of air rushing over the fuselage. The Dreamliner shuddered under her hands. Collins's breathing slowed. "We're at flight level 410, 480 knots, fuel 60%. Strong crosswinds, closest diversion." "Is Reykjavik?" "Good," Maria said, her eyes scanning the primary flight display. She felt the tension in her own shoulders ease by a fraction, not because the situation was under control, but because she was back where she knew exactly what to do. She pressed the intercom. "Gander Center. American 2156 Heavy. Mayday. Mayday. Dual pilot incapacitation. Former Air Force captain at the controls. Request immediate. Vectors for emergency descent and diversion to closest suitable airport." The controller's voice came back after a pause just long enough to register surprise. "American 2156, confirm? You're a passenger flying the aircraft?" "Affirmative. Former USAF captain, 7 years, multi-engine. Current on Boeing 787 systems. Ready for vectors." "Roger. American 2156. Turn right heading 090. Descend to flight level 200. Reykjavik available. Emergency services on standby." "Copy. Heading 090. Descending to 200. Maria said, already easing the nose down. The vertical speed indicator ticked lower. Altitude unwinding at a controlled rate. Outside, the sky was chaos. Turbulence tossed the aircraft in rolling motions, but Maria's hands compensated in small, deliberate movements, each correction timed, measured. She felt the rhythm of the storm in her bones, reading the gusts before they hit. "Collins," she said, without looking away from the instruments. "Inform cabin crew. Emergency. Approach. Prepare for possible evacuation." He nodded and relayed the message. Moments later, Rachel's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, Captain Santos is flying us to Iceland for an emergency landing. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions carefully. Somewhere." Behind the closed door, Maria heard the murmur of passengers. Confusion, disbelief, hope. She pushed it aside. This wasn't about them seeing her. It was about getting them on the ground alive. "Check environmental," she said. Collins scanned. The readout. Cabin pressure holding steady. Hydraulics stabilizing but still fluctuating. "Noted," Maria replied. Her mind cataloged the risks. If the hydraulics failed, gear and flaps could become unreliable. She'd need to be ready to land in a higher speed configuration. The descent was steady now, the buffeting slightly less violent as they left the worst of the jet stream. Collins glanced sideways. "You've done this before." Maria allowed herself the smallest hint of a smile. Not exactly like this, but close enough. Her eyes flicked to the captain, Doctor. Chung was still monitoring him, the oxygen mask fogging slightly with each shallow breath. "How's he doing?" "Pulse is weak but stable, Doctor." Chun answered without looking up. "Possible cardiac event. We'll know more on the ground." Maria gave a short nod. "Then let's get him there." A TC handed them off to Reykjavik approach. The new controller's voice was crisp, calm. "American 2156 Heavy. Cleared direct runway 01. Wind 020 at 15. Emergency vehicles are in position." "Cleared direct 01, Maria confirmed. She pictured the approach in her mind. Altitude steps, speed gates, crosswind correction. Every detail mapped before they even saw the runway lights. The Dreamliner pierced a break in the clouds, revealing the Arctic twilight. The horizon was painted in muted blues and silver. The snow-dusted coastline of Iceland, stretching like a jagged blade against the sea. Collins ran the checklist, his voice steadier now. Gear down. Flaps 30. Approach speed 140 knots. Emergency configuration confirmed. Maria adjusted the throttles with precision. The runway came into view, a glowing strip carved into the icy landscape, framed by the flashing lights of fire trucks and ambulances. She spoke quietly, almost to herself. All right, let's bring her home. The final descent was a balance of instinct and discipline. Crosswind from the right, adjust rudder. Sink rate just under 700 feet per minute. Keep the center line. In the sight picture, don't let the nose wander at 50 feet. She began the flare, smooth, unhurried. The main gear kissed the runway with barely a bump. Reverse thrust engaged, braking firm but controlled. The Dreamliner slowed, the roar fading into a low rumble as they rolled to a stop. Maria released the yoke, her hands finally still. Welcome to Iceland, she said, exhaling the words like she'd been holding them in since she left her seat in 18C. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The aircraft sat still on the icy runway, its engines winding down to a muted hum. The only sound inside the cabin was breathing, quick, uneven, human. It was as if everyone was waiting for permission to believe they were safe. Then the applause began, soft at first, scattered, then swelling until it filled the fuselage. Passengers cried openly. Some called out, "Thank you." Others simply clasped their hands together, as if in prayer. Maria didn't turn to acknowledge them. Her hands stayed on the controls, eyes fixed on the taxiway ahead. She'd learned in the Air Force that the moment you relaxed too soon was the moment something could still go wrong. Only once the aircraft was chalked and the parking brake set did she allow herself to exhale. "Collins," she said quietly, "you've got post-landing checklist." He nodded, voice steadier now. "Copy." His hands moved with practiced care, ticking through each item as Maria monitored the ground crew outside the window. The cockpit door opened. Rachel stepped in, her composure visibly frayed, but her eyes shining with relief. "We're stopped. Emergency crews are ready to board for the captain, and passengers keep asking for you." Maria shook her head. "They don't need me. They need to get off the plane safely and see their families. That's the priority." Rachel hesitated, then nodded. "Understood." The medics came first. Bright yellow jackets, headlamps cutting through the dim cabin light. They moved quickly to the left seat, lifting Captain Davis onto a stretcher. His face was still pale, but the faint rise and fall of his chest was a small victory. Dr. Chun followed them down the aisle, relaying vitals in clipped sentences. Maria stayed in her seat as they worked, her gaze fixed on the faint green glow of the overhead panel. Outside, the Icelandic night pressed close against the cockpit windows, the runway lights blurring through a sheen of frost. Only when the last of the passengers had been escorted off did she stand. The cockpit felt strangely quiet now, the alarm silenced, the hum of systems fading. She stepped into the empty aisle, walking slowly toward the forward exit. The air in the cabin was warmer than she expected, tinged with the faint scent of spilled coffee and adrenaline. Rows of abandoned blankets and half-eaten meals marked the seats where fear had sat only minutes ago. At the door, the first blast of cold air hit her, sharp, clean, bracing. The runway was lined with emergency vehicles, their rotating lights painting the snow in red and blue. A tall man in a reflective jacket stood at the base of the stairs, looking up with an expression caught between awe and disbelief. "Captain Santos?" he asked, his accent Nordic, his voice firm but warm. Maria hesitated for half a beat, then adjusted her denim jacket. "Maria Santos," she corrected. "Former Air Force." The man extended a gloved hand. "Björn Eriksson, emergency coordinator. You saved 320 people tonight." Maria shook his hand, the cold biting her skin. "I flew the plane," she said evenly. "Saving them was everyone's job." Björn smiled faintly. "Maybe, but without you, This could have ended very differently. He stepped aside to let her pass. Beyond him, passengers clustered together on the tarmac, huddled under blankets handed out by ground staff. Some pointed toward her, murmuring to each other. A few lifted their phones, but she kept walking, head down, toward the terminal. Inside, the heat of the building felt almost oppressive after the icy air outside. A uniformed airline manager approached quickly, flanked by 2 security staff. "Captain Santos." "Maria," she corrected again. He inclined his head. "Maria, the media's already calling. We can get you into a private room, away from the press, until you decide how to proceed." Her first instinct was to refuse, to keep moving, to disappear into the anonymity she'd been chasing since leaving the service. But there was a different kind of duty in her now. Passengers would want answers. The airline would want statements. And somewhere in the building, a captain lay in a medical bay, alive because she'd stepped forward. "Private room," she agreed. "But first, I need to check on Captain Davis." The walk to the airport's medical center was short, but the corridor felt long. Every few steps, someone recognized her, a passenger from the flight, a member of the crew, and offered a quiet, "Thank you." She nodded each time, keeping her stride steady. When she stepped into the small, brightly lit room, Dr. Parker looked up from where she sat beside Davis's bed. "He's stable, still unconscious, but stable. The hospital team will take over from here." Maria stood at the foot of the bed, hands in her jacket pockets. "Good." She looked at him for a long moment, the lines of strain around his eyes even in rest. "He's lucky," she said softly. "Doctor." Parker met her gaze. "You all are." Maria left without another word. By the time she reached the private conference room, the hum of distant voices outside told her the press had arrived. She could already imagine the headlines. "Tourist saves jet. Mystery pilot revealed." But she pushed the thought aside. For now, she wanted only one thing: silence. The airline manager closed the door behind her, leaving her alone with the muted ticking of a wall clock. She sat in the chair farthest from the window, elbows on her knees, head bowed. The adrenaline was fading now, leaving behind the deep, bone-heavy exhaustion she remembered from long missions. She'd promised herself she was done with this life. But tonight had reminded her of something she'd tried to ignore. The sky never really lets you go. The conference room stayed silent long after the airline manager left her. Maria sat there, listening to the faint hum of the ventilation and the muffled movement of people outside. The adrenaline that had carried her for the past 2 hours was bleeding out of her system, leaving behind a hollowness she knew well. It was the same emptiness that followed missions, the quiet after the chaos. When all that was left was the sound of your own breathing, she rubbed her eyes with the heel of her hand. The clock on the wall read 21:47. The flight had been scheduled to land in Amsterdam the next morning. Instead, she was in Iceland, in a closed-off room in the arrivals wing, with the beginnings of a media storm building outside. There was a soft knock at the door. Rachel stepped in, still in her uniform, her hair slightly out of place. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it. "I didn't get to say it before," Rachel said quietly. "Thank you for everything." Maria shook her head. "You kept that cabin calm when you didn't have to. That matters more than people think." Rachel's eyes glistened for a second before she pushed herself upright. "They're taking the passengers to hotels. I'll make sure you get one away from the press. You've earned some peace tonight." Peace, the word felt foreign. By the time she reached the terminal exit, the journalists had gathered. Cameras flashed. Voices called her name, or what they thought was her name. She kept her head down, moving quickly through the crowd with 2 security staff flanking her. Questions blurred into noise. Were you really a passenger? Were you trained? How did you know what to do? The hotel room they gave her was quiet, warm, and overlooked the dark sweep of Faxafloy Bay. She dropped her backpack on the bed, still zipped from the morning, and stood for a moment, looking at it. That bag was supposed to be the start of something new. Tonight it felt like a remnant of something she might never escape. Her phone vibrated. Ashley's name lit up the screen. "Girl." Ashley's voice came through immediately, breathless. "You're everywhere. You're on CNN, BBC. There's even a photo of you walking into the cockpit." Maria sank onto the bed, leaning back against the headboard. "I didn't exactly plan on it. You saved 300 people, Maria. You can't just, I don't know, act like it's nothing." "It's not nothing," Maria said softly. It's just not what I'm supposed to be doing anymore." There was a pause on the other end. "Maybe you don't get to decide that. Maybe some things decide for you." They talked for a few minutes more, Ashley trying to make her laugh, Maria deflecting with quiet answers. When the call ended, the room felt too still again. She pulled the curtains open and stepped onto the small balcony. The air was sharp, the kind that carried the faint salt of the ocean. Above her, the northern lights shimmered. Slow, deliberate waves of green and violet curling against the black sky. She stood there for a long time, letting the cold seep into her. The lights moved like they had all the time in the world, unbothered by the small chaos of human lives below. Somewhere behind her, the hotel phone rang. She didn't move to answer it. Her thoughts drifted instead to the moment she'd stood in the aisle, telling Rachel she was a pilot. She hadn't hesitated then. She'd simply stepped forward. No weighing the risks, no calculating the consequences. Just instinct. And maybe that was the problem. When she finally went back inside, the phone had stopped ringing. There was a note slipped under her door. "American Airlines CEO requests to speak with you at your earliest convenience." Maria stared at it for a long moment, then set it on the desk. She wasn't ready to answer anyone's questions yet. Not the CEO's, not the media's, maybe not even her own tonight. She needed only one thing: to remember that they had landed, and that every passenger had walked away. She lay back on the bed without changing, staring at the ceiling until her eyes grew heavy. The last thing she saw before sleep took her was the faint reflection of the aurora in the balcony glass. A sky that, whether she wanted it or not, still seemed to be calling her back. The morning came too soon. Maria woke to a pale wash of winter light filtering through the thin hotel curtains. For a moment, she lay still, listening to the quiet. No engines, no alarms, no clipped voices in her headset. Just the hum of a sun radiator and the faint gull cries from the bay. Her phone was already buzzing on the nightstand. Missed calls, messages stacked in a column she didn't want to scroll through. Half of them from numbers she didn't recognize, the other half from Ashley, alternating between "call me now" and links to news articles she hadn't read yet. She ignored it all. Instead, she moved to the balcony and breathed in the cold morning air. The aurora was gone, replaced by a sky the color of steel. Somewhere out there, on a different runway, another crew was performing pre-flight checks for a trip across the same ocean she'd flown last night. Her knock at the door was sharp and businesslike. She opened it to find a man in a dark suit, crisp enough to have been unpacked just this morning. "Captain Santos?" he said. She hesitated. "Maria." He nodded once. "I'm with American Airlines Corporate. We've arranged a private car to take you to our Reykjavik operations office. The CEO will be joining us by video." It wasn't a request. The drive through the city was short. Streets still held traces of snow in the gutters, and the shops were only just beginning to open. The office was glass and steel, modern and quiet. The kind of place where everything smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant. They ushered her into a conference room with a large screen at the far end. On it, the CEO appeared. Tailored suit, practiced smile, a tone that suggested both gratitude and calculation. "Captain Santos," he began. "First, let me say what you did yesterday was extraordinary. Your actions saved lives, and on behalf of the airline, we thank you." Maria sat with her hands folded loosely in her lap, I did what needed to be done." The CEO leaned forward slightly, his image crisp in the high-definition feed. "Be that as it may, it takes rare skill to handle a 787 in those conditions, especially without a current airline seat." She didn't answer. He glanced off camera for a moment, then back at her. "We'd like to discuss the possibility of your involvement with our training department. Consulting, emergency procedure development, simulator evaluations, nothing binding yet. Just a conversation." Maria studied him for a long moment. "I'm not looking for work." His smile didn't waver. "That's fine, but consider that last night you were the difference between an emergency and a disaster. You've been out of the cockpit 6 months, and you still had the instincts. Imagine what you could do with those instincts sharpened again." She felt a flicker in her chest. Not excitement, exactly, but recognition. The kind that came when someone said something you'd already been thinking, but hadn't wanted to admit. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "That's all I ask." The meeting ended as quickly as it began. Back in the car, Maria watched Reykjavik pass by in silence. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at the edge of something, a return she hadn't planned for, a pull she wasn't sure she wanted to resist. At the hotel, Rachel was waiting in the lobby. "No uniform today, just a wool coat and tired eyes. Thought you might want company," she said. They sat in the hotel cafe, mugs of coffee between them, the hum of conversation low around them. For the first time since the landing, Maria let herself ask the question she'd been avoiding. How bad did it get back there? In the cabin, Rachel's gaze was steady. People were scared. Some were panicking. But when you stood up, it was like something shifted. They believed you. That's rare. Maria looked down into her coffee. Belief doesn't land a plane. No, Rachel said. But it can keep 300 people from tearing each other apart before someone does. They spoke a little longer about the flight, about Captain Davis's condition, about the news cycle that had already spun Maria into a headline. But beneath it all, Maria felt the same quiet truth pressing against her ribs. Flying wasn't just something she had done. It was still part of who she was. And if she was honest with herself, last night hadn't just been about saving lives. It had felt right. When Rachel left, Maria stayed in the cafe for another hour, letting her coffee go cold. Outside, the wind pushed thin sheets of snow across the street, the kind that erased footprints within minutes. She wondered if this was what her own life looked like now. The track she thought she'd left behind slowly disappearing, until all that was left was the path back to the sky. By the third day in Reykjavik, Maria couldn't walk through the hotel lobby without someone recognizing her. At first, it was passengers from the flight, a quick thank you in the elevator, a nod in the cafe, then came strangers who had seen her on the news, their phones already in hand before they approached. She kept her answers polite but short, always finding a way to step aside. The airline had offered to fly her on to Amsterdam or back to New York. She'd refused both, choosing to stay in Iceland until Captain Davis was stable enough for transfer. She told herself it was loyalty to the crew, but deep down, she knew it was also avoidance. The morning news played on a muted TV in the lobby. Her own face, caught mid-step, denim jacket collar turned up against the cold, hovered next to a headline. Tourist or hero? The mystery pilot who landed American 2156. She caught fragments of the anchor's voice before turning away. Sources confirm she was a decorated Air Force captain. Questions about whether she returned to flying. In the elevator, her phone buzzed with a new email. The sender's name was unfamiliar. She opened it anyway. Dear Captain Santos, I was in seat 42A on your flight. I have 2 daughters. We made it home because you didn't hesitate. I don't have the right words, but thank you. Maria read it twice before deleting it, not because she didn't care, but because it made something in her chest ache in a way she didn't want to carry around all day. That afternoon, she went to see Captain Davis. The hospital room was quiet, except for the soft beep of monitors. He looked better than the night they'd landed, color back in his face, breathing steadier. A nurse said he'd woken briefly, asked where he was, and gone back to sleep. On the walk back to the hotel, Maria found herself scanning the low winter sky. The cloud ceiling was low, the kind that swallowed mountains whole. She thought about how it would look from above, the clean break into sunlight, the horizon stretching unbroken. That evening, the airline sent another representative, a senior training captain named Wilson. He was older, with the kind of posture that said he'd spent decades in cockpits. "I've read your record," he said, sliding into the booth across from her in the hotel restaurant. "Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal, 7 years active duty. You could walk into any airline tomorrow and have a seat." "I'm not looking for a seat," Maria said. Wilson studied her for a long moment. "You're afraid coming back will mean you never get to leave again." She said nothing. "That's the thing about flying," he went on. "You can walk away. You can tell yourself you're done. But the first time you smell jet fuel on a cold morning, or feel the yoke push back against you in turbulence, you remember. And remembering is dangerous if you're trying to stay grounded." Maria let out a slow breath. "I'm not sure I want to live in that world again." "Maybe not," Wilson said. "But last week, that world needed you, and you didn't hesitate." He left her with that, not pressing further. Later, alone in her room, Maria stood at the window. Snow had started to fall, tiny flakes drifting in the streetlight glow. She pressed her palm against the glass and felt the cold seep into her skin. She thought about the passengers, the terrified eyes, the held breaths, the weight of silence in the seconds before she stood up. She thought about the way the controls had felt under her hands, the instinctive corrections. The moment when she knew the landing would be safe, it wasn't just muscle memory. It was belonging, and maybe Wilson was right. Maybe once you knew that feeling, you never really stopped being a pilot. The storm had cleared by morning. Maria woke to a sky of pale gold, sunlight skating across the snow in sharp, bright patches. She dressed without hurry, pulling on boots and her thick jacket, but without knowing exactly where she was going. By mid-morning, she found herself in a taxi heading toward Keflavik International. She'd told herself it was curiosity, to see the airport in daylight, maybe thank the ground crew who had met them on the runway. But as the car rolled past the perimeter fence, her gaze caught on the rows of aircraft parked in the winter light. Dreamliners, Airbuses, narrow bodies lined up like chess pieces, their tails catching the sun. Even from here, she could almost hear the faint thrum of APU units, the smell of jet fuel just out of reach. The driver dropped her at the small operations building. Inside, the air was warm and smelled faintly of coffee and metal. A young ground crewman recognized her immediately, his eyes widening. "You're the one from the American flight," he said. "Captain Maria," she corrected gently. He grinned. "Right, Maria. Want to see your plane?" She hesitated, but her feet were already moving before she answered. The Dreamliner sat on a remote stand, a light dusting of frost across its nose. It looked ordinary. No sign of the chaos it had carried over the Atlantic. No hint of the fear it had held in its cabin. A maintenance tech stood by the forward stairs. "We've been going over her since the landing," he said. "Systems check. Flight controls. She's sound. Just needed someone who knew what they were doing." Maria stepped into the cockpit. The seats were empty now, the overhead quiet, the displays dark. But when she lowered herself into the left seat, it was as if the space remembered her. Her hands fell naturally to the armrests, her eyes tracing the familiar arcs of switches and screens. 7 years of service, thousands of flight hours. Every muscle in her body seemed to understand this place better than anywhere else. She closed her eyes. For a moment, she was back in the descent, the runway lights ahead, The smooth flare, the jolt of wheels meeting earth, the silence that followed when she opened her eyes. The winter light poured through the windshield. Sharp and white, she left the cockpit without saying much, but the decision had already begun to settle in her chest. That evening, she walked the harbor near her hotel. Fishing boats rocked gently against the piers, their masts clinking in the wind. A family passed her, bundled against the cold, the youngest clutching a paper cup of hot chocolate. She wondered if they had been on her flight, if they even knew who she was. Her phone rang. This time, she answered without looking at the caller ID. It was Captain Wilson. "You went to sea." "The plane," he said. "Not a question." Maria didn't answer. "That's your answer, isn't it?" She stopped walking, looking out over the dark water. The wind cut across her face, carrying the tang of salt. "I'm not sure yet. Sure enough to know you're not done," Wilson replied. They said nothing more. When she hung up, Maria stood there a while longer, the lights of the harbor reflecting in the black water. The decision wasn't loud. It wasn't a burst of certainty or a sudden rush. It was quiet, almost gentle, like the way the northern lights had moved across the sky her first night here. Some things didn't ask for permission to return. They just did. 6 months later, the Denver air was thin and bright, the kind that made distant mountains look close enough to touch. Maria stood at the front of a simulator bay in United's training facility, the giant mock-up of a cockpit glowing softly behind her. The room smelled faintly of electronics and coffee, the familiar scent of long training days. She wore the instructor's uniform now, her name stitched neatly above the breast pocket. Santos. The wings pinned above it were new, but the weight they carried was the same. 2 young pilots sat in the simulator seats, adjusting headsets, flipping switches with the overcautious care of rookies. Maria watched them for a moment before speaking. "Today," she said, "we're running an emergency descent scenario. You'll lose autopilot. One of you will simulate incapacitation. The other will get the aircraft on the ground." The pilots glanced at each other nervously. She stepped closer. "Here's the thing. You never know when it's going to be real. I thought my flying days were behind me. I thought I'd left the Air Force, left the cockpit, and moved on. And then, one night over the Atlantic, 320 people needed me to remember exactly who I was. They were listening now. The simulator's quiet hum the only sound in the room? I'm not telling you this for drama," Maria continued. "I'm telling you because when it happens, and someday it will, there won't be time to decide whether you're ready. You'll just have to be. Every hour you train for that moment will matter." She moved back toward the console, hands resting lightly on the controls. "All right, let's see what you've got." The session ran long. By the time they stepped out of the simulator, the sun was dropping behind the Rockies, turning the sky the same kind of bruised purple she remembered from Iceland's twilight. Maria stayed behind after the others left, standing in the doorway of the empty simulator. The quiet wrapped around her in a way that felt like both a beginning and an ending. That night, she walked out to the edge of the airfield. The wind cut across the open tarmac, carrying with it the distant roar of an aircraft taking off. Lights lifted into the dark, steady and sure, vanishing into the same kind of night she had once faced with nothing but instinct and training. She thought about the passengers, faces she would never see again, lives she would never know. They had gone on with their journeys, just as she had gone on with hers. In the end, the gap year she had promised herself hadn't been about escape at all. It had been about return, because some callings aren't jobs. They aren't roles you can hang up or walk away from. They're part of you, stitched into your muscles, your reflexes, the way you see the world. And when the moment comes, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall back on who you've always been. She turned back toward the building, the sound of another departure fading into the night. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts, and sometimes the sky calls you home, not to remind you of where you've been, but to show you that you've never truly left.